these are the exact same demand. They are basically a surrender document. It's so preposterous that I think even the Russians know that it's absurd, that Zelensky will probably survive this period, but it's certainly an unwelcome distraction.
President Trump has been, in the past, it seems, trying to use, what is it, honey to catch flies.
The Trump administration has been quietly negotiating with Moscow on a brand new 28-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. And it seems to me that the Russians decided to leak it. It makes for grim reading. Ukraine forced to surrender territory it currently controls and reduce its armed forces to a husk. It sounds a lot like lipstick slapped on Putin's big demands that he's been making from day one. So no wonder senior Russian officials are already signalling their optimism. The plan's a brainchild of envoy Steve Witkoff, who some say is taking advantage of Zelensky's corruption crisis in Kyiv to foist a bad deal on an ally. Other insiders say the plan is dead on arrival and is nothing but Russia's maximalist demands dressed up with some bullet points. So it raised eyebrows to see President Trump today dispatch Army Secretary Dan Driscoll plus 2 4-star generals to Kyiv, for emergency talks alongside Witkoff's negotiations as well. Still with me in the studio, Alex Sawyer and Jim Antle. But joining us tonight from Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee, Ukraine correspondent, war correspondent, filmmaker extraordinaire, a man that's been chronicling this awful conflict now for many years from the capital of Ukraine. Good evening, Oz. How are you?
Good evening, Harry. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's been a difficult 24-hour period for Ukraine. 26 people dead in this strike in western Ukraine in the early hours of the morning. So, these are the realities that are, just daily in and outs for Ukraine. And I just feel that it's important that we highlight that while all these talks are happening, Ukrainian civilians are still bearing the brunt of all of these attacks.
Oh, absolutely. The Americans seem to be trying to do lots of different things at once. We had the news tonight that the official Ukrainian envoy, Kellogg, has said that he will no longer be taking part in these negotiations come January. Suggestions that he's been sort of undermined and undercut by Steve Witkoff, who had some success, I think it's fair to say, in Gaza, bringing a ceasefire around there, releasing the hostages. It was a deal done by suspending all normal diplomatic, routes and norms, and done over the sort of business table with the Gulf states. President Trump finally putting sanctions on Russian oil companies 2 weeks ago, which was a welcome surprise, I think, for many. And now Lindsey Graham is saying he's greenlit further Ukraine support bills within Congress, and he's publicly saying that he's annoyed with Putin. Yet this plan of Witkoff's that's leaked tonight, and it looks like the Russians leaked it given Witkoff accidentally tweeted that, it must have been the Russians, and then swiftly deleted his tweet. That plan looks like nothing more than what Putin's been demanding since February 2022.
You sum it up well there. These are the exact same demand. They are basically a surrender document being, presented to the Ukrainians over and over again by Steve Witkoff, who has proven without a shadow of a doubt that he doesn't have a clue what's going on here. He just basically sits there like a yapping dog in every meeting with the Russians and comes back saying the same thing. It's important to note that there is a conflict within the Trump administration about how to deal with this. You've got people like Witkoff and Vance who basically just want the war to go away. They're willing to give Russia whatever it wants as long as it ends. And then you've got Rubio and Kellogg now stepping away who have a very different position, a much more hawkish position towards Russia and towards Ukraine. The Ukrainian strategy has been to just basically do whatever they can to agree with Trump, to get him on side and to demonstrate that they are showing that they are ready for whatever kinds of, ceasefire. Whatever Trump's asked for, the Ukrainians have basically been like, yeah, we'll do it. And the Russians have been the ones that have ultimately failed to turn up to negotiations, failed to agree to things, back out at the last minute. But the biggest point, the biggest takeaway you have to take away from this is that these demands that Ukraine withdraws from its own territory that Russia doesn't control is just so absurd that no Ukrainian government would survive trying to enact those policies. There would be riots on the streets, absolutely, if that was the case. So
you made a point earlier on, I think it was on X, that the Russians don't, the Ukrainians don't have to seek the Americans' permission to carry on fighting if they want. They don't need to seek the Americans' permission to cut a deal. Would the armed forces wouldn't wear this? You let alone you talk about the people rioting, but the forces on the front line wouldn't put up with this, would they?
Yeah, I mean, look, the military has a very important role to play, but it should be stressed that, like liberal democracies around Europe, the military doesn't have a political role. So there hasn't really been a huge amount of pushback from the armed forces towards anything going on. But I do suspect that they would have something to say about abandoning the fortress belt. Again, it's a total non-starter. The idea that Ukraine would give Russia its most heavily armed, heavily defended cities and then reduce its armed forces and reduce the weapons that they've got. It's just inviting Russia to invade. It's so preposterous that I think even the Russians know that it's absurd. What's immensely frustrating for Kyiv is that Witkoff seems to be, just convinced that trying this over and over again is going to work. And
the definition of trying the same thing over and over again. We've heard that one before. Just while you're here, though, it's not been a great couple of weeks for Zelensky. He is up to his neck. Well, his government is up to his neck in corruption scandals. Key figures are falling like flies. Those figures are getting closer and closer and closer to his office. For the first time since the war started, you've had opposition MPs really say, you know what, the war consensus is over now. Yes, we need elections, and yes, we need a new premier. How much trouble is Zelensky in? Question one. And do you suspect that Witkoff or others are taking advantage of that domestic weakness that Zelensky is now in? There's no love lost between this administration in DC and Zelensky. Are they taking advantage of his political weakness to try and foist him into swallowing a deal that he wouldn't otherwise accept?
So I do think there's probably people looking externally and thinking that this would be a good moment to increase the pressure on Zelensky if you're trying to get him to concede to things. But I think it's also important to note that I would say that the trouble that Zelensky had when he briefly suspended the autonomy of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the bodies that are now carrying out this investigation, and there were protests on the street, that seemed to be a more dangerous moment for Zelensky than now, whereas the Bureau's doing its job, prosecutions are starting, politicians who are involved in this, yes, they may be close to Zelensky, but they are... The National Anti-Corruption Bureau is being seen by the public to be doing its job. And yes, there have been some calls from the opposition, but not necessarily aimed at Zelensky, definitely aimed at the ministers in the government that have been responsible.
Kira Rudik, the Liberal MP, has been saying, quite openly that it's time for a new leader.
I mean, look, there are some voices that are saying that, but I don't think it's like widespread overall that people are calling for that kind. It's still it's not the consensus view of the opposition.
Okay.
Put it that way. And I do think that Zelensky will probably survive this period, but it's certainly an unwelcome distraction domestically at a time when Ukraine is trying to gather international support. And that international support is so dependent on Ukraine proving itself that it can deal with its internal corruption
that was going to be my final question. You took the words quite out of my mouth. Fine, he might survive domestically, but how damaging is this? When he's going around Europe and he's going around America, shaking the tin, trying to negotiate new weapons, trying to negotiate new finances, new investments, rebuilding funds. How damaging is it to him on the world stage amongst the wider coalition that it looks like the sort of what everyone slightly suspected and has known for a long time about vast parts of Ukraine's society is that is he really getting this under control, or is it just been the war's just suppressed coverage of it, and actually this is all going to blow up again?
I mean, look, this anti-corruption stuff has been happening for a long time in Ukraine. This particular investigation is a culmination of 14 months worth of work. So a lot of work has been going on behind the scenes before we reach this point. So I would stress to people at home, like, my view from Kyiv here is, as long as the anti-corruption bureaus are seen to be doing their job and are doing so unimpeded by Zelensky, he will continue to have that legitimacy, not necessarily, overwhelming support or whatever, but the legitimacy to carry on in the position that he's in, as long as the National Anti-Corruption Bureau can carry on the work that they've been doing, which is warmly received in the public or widely behind. So it really depends on how these waters are navigated by Kyiv over the coming few months. Definitely one to keep an eye on, though, 100%, Harry.
In Kyiv. Keep your head down, stay safe, and thanks for joining us as ever. See you very soon, I hope. Still in the studio with me, Alex Sawyer of the Washington Times, Jim Antle of the Washington Examiner. Alex, Donald Trump would like nothing more than an excuse to basically say, "Time's up, buddy." Zelensky, we don't think there's peace while you're still here. This goes way back to the original Hunter Biden
You
stuff.
were reading my mind.
Yeah.
I think there's some bad blood that goes all the way back to when he was wanting them to, Rudy Giuliani was going to work with Bill Barr to find out if there was some sort of server that ended up in Ukraine.
Right.
He was impeached over that.
Yeah, part of the original impeachment process was a phone call with Zelensky.
Yeah, so I think there's just been years of, a bad taste in Trump's mouth when it comes to Ukraine, and rightfully so. You just talked about the anti-corruption. I mean, the country's been known for corruption. And I think the American people are hesitant about that. They've heard so much about that, and then they see how much tax dollars were going to Ukraine. Of course, it's not that they're on the side of supporting Putin by any means, but I think that everyone's antennas are up and they're ready. Just that America first. I think there's a move for isolationists. Like, they don't want to see they want to see their money spent here. Look at what we have with our education system. There's a lot that it could be done.
Jim, the president promised to end this war in a day, a week, a month, various different iterations. The Alaska summit basically put everything back to square one. Right. The Budapest summit that was mooted last month has, yet failed to materialise. The Russians clearly are stringing him along, playing a merry tune. They haven't changed their maximalist demands. War weariness, as Alex says, amongst the American public is massive, and not just psychologically, but in the wallet as well. At some point, is the president just going to lose his temper here and just be like, I don't swear because we're going out live on the radio in Britain, but, F it?
Right. Well, I think he's gotten close to that a couple of times, but I think he's really invested in the idea of resolving this conflict, and I think...
For his gong.
for his legacy, and I think the fact that they were successful in Gaza, at least in the short term, in the immediate term, when they weren't given very good chances of succeeding, I think has really encouraged him to want to try. I think the problem is he really hasn't found an effective leverage point over Putin.
Well, the oil stuff seems to be hurting. Russian oil exports down to their lowest level in 2 years.
And maybe that will do it eventually, but it hasn't done it yet. Russia perceives itself to be winning the war, and there is a limit to what the United States is willing to do, and there's a limit to what Europe is able to do, regardless of what they say. So unless the economic situation becomes really untenable, which perhaps at some point it will, Putin, I think, feels that he can simply wait all of this out and eventually wait Trump out, and also to a certain degree, if the conditions on the ground in Ukraine get bad enough, even a bad deal eventually starts to look like a good deal. But I think there are still a lot of forces within the Trump administration that don't want to do that. And I think Trump himself is frustrated with Putin. He thought he'd be able to persuade Putin to see the error of his ways, and he hasn't.
He says every time, doesn't he? He says every time I talk to this guy, he promises the world, he says this, and we have these great conversations, and he does the exact opposite. The oil sanctions were a big moment a couple of weeks ago. MBS leader of Saudi Arabia was in town. I think he's still here. He was definitely here last night. I think he's still here today. One phone call from Trump to MBS and asking him to turn on the taps and of oil production could put the Russians out of business pretty quickly. Yeah,
and I think it would be smart to move in that direction. I think also, to your point, President Trump has been, in the past, it seems, trying to use, what is it, honey to catch flies,
Right, yes.
trying to be really
Right.
sweet towards...
Carrots versus sticks.
Yeah.
And he's taken a lot of political heat for that as well.
So much. Like Putin's puppet. How many
Yeah.
times did we hear Democrats say that? I think Nancy Pelosi, that was one of her favorite sayings. But it doesn't seem to be working. And now you're hearing him kind of change his tune a bit. Yeah. There's some frustration. And I think that they need to go back to the drawing board. There's something he needs to do differently here, because Putin, trying to get through to Putin it's not working.
It does. This administration, compared to Trump 45, 1.0, whatever you want to call it, has been remarkably disciplined. At the very top of the administration, Rubio, Vance, to some degree, Hesketh, they're a pretty tight ship. There hasn't been the same briefing wars and everything. On this one issue, it feels to me like this is the first time it's really started to crack, when actually we're starting to read and report on, actual open divisions within the administration, Jim. Kellogg, I can't remember his first name for the life of me, I apologise. Keith Kellogg, there we go, I should have remembered that one. He has, he's walked out basically and said, basically Witkoff is undermining him, undercutting him. Oz there in Kyiv was talking about the sort of difference between Rubio and JD Vance on this matter. It is clear that there is tension in the otherwise pretty tight Oval Office.
I think that's true on foreign policy in general. I don't think that's limited to Russia, Ukraine.
Okay.
I think the Middle East may be the only area where there's more or less, much lesser in Venezuela. But it's pretty clear Rubio is driving the boat on Venezuela.
I wouldn't want to be driving a boat anywhere near Venezuela right now.
Pardon the pun.
The escape boat. He's driving the escape boat. But Russia, Ukraine obviously is just been an intractable issue for this administration. And I think that's where you're going to see some of these divisions and frustrations come to a head. It either gets resolved or it doesn't, rather conspicuously. Whereas on some of these smaller issues, they can pivot or deprioritize pretty easily.
Alex, critics of the president kind of unfairly and underestimating him, say, he just regurgitates the last thing someone told him on this issue. I think that's probably not quite true. Do you think we'll see a resolution to this within before the midterms, within the active part of the presidency?
I hope so. And, I think that his focus will be there. It sounds like it is. It's one of the areas that he's looking towards for his Nobel Peace Prize, right? But to your point, I think it's great when there's some disagreement.
Creative tension.
Yes, I do. I think sometimes some of the best results come out of that. More ideas, as long as there's not too many leaks, we should be good.
Well, the leaks certainly have dried up, which is a shame for all journalists trying to cover this administration. It was much more fun last time around.